That's running. You'll see our on-air lights come on. Then I'll do a little introduction from here, and I'll pass it over to Nalini to begin. So just hold on, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Living Archives, Moving Tides, Black Feminist Caribbean Thought. Now, this is a symposium celebrating Merle Collins. It's organized by the the Caribbean Studies Working Group Center with the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, as well as the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. Now, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, the present, and the future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Here at Fourth Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, examining research questions, projects, things happening all across the university. Now, we're running today's event as a live stream both to YouTube as well as a Zoom meeting. So if you're joining us there, you have comments or questions, that's great. Pop those into the chat. We'll do our best to read those out a little bit later. If you're here with us in the space and you have comments or questions, just raise your hand and we'll run a microphone around so that everyone can hear. Okay, enough from me. It's very much my pleasure now to pass the microphone over to Associate Professor in Geography, Planning, and Environment. I'm not introducing Nalini. I'm instead going to quickly transition to introduce the Director of Events and Community Engagement at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, as well as a PhD candidate. And I'm very happy to have here this morning to introduce us, Dr. Marlene Lopez. Welcome.
Thank you. So my name's Marlene Lopez, and I'm the Women's Studies, Black Studies Advisor and Program Coordinator for the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. On behalf of the Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's symposium titled Living Archives, Moving Tides, Celebrating the Work of Dr. Merle Collins. We are honored to welcome community members, organizers, artists, and scholars whose work continues to shape and expand the academic, cultural, and political terrain of Black feminist thought. This symposium emerges from an ongoing commitment to think critically and collectively about diaspora as a site of knowledge production, a geography of struggle, and a space where Black feminist praxis and thought have long intervened against the violence of colonialism, racial capitalism, patriarchy, and other systems of oppression. Black feminist Caribbean thought does not simply respond to these conditions, it generates its own analytical frameworks, methodologies, and possibilities for reworlding. At the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, we are dedicated to interdisciplinary feminist scholarship that is rooted in social justice, community engagement, and transformative pedagogy. Participating in the organization of events like these responds to its mandate. It reflects our commitment to fostering conversations that move across disciplines and geographies and that center knowledge-making practices of communities who have been historically erased and excluded from academic spaces. We would like to extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Nalini Mohabir and Tesfa Peterson and the Caribbean Studies Working Group for trusting us to come on board as organizers. I would also like to thank Erin Benzakin for our lovely poster and visuals and admin support, as well as our sponsors, Réseau Québécois en Études Féministes, Le Centre for Interdisciplinary Studies and Culture, the Black Perspective Office, Kristen Young at the Office of Community Engagement, the Grenadian Association, and the Department of Geography, Planning, and the Environment, whose support has made this symposium possible. Finally, we'd like to also thank Nigel Thomas and folks at Logos Reading for their invaluable contributions to this event. As we begin today's conversations, we also understand this gathering as an opportunity to expand the boundaries of Black feminist thought beyond North American context, to push at its edges and to embrace its possibilities. It is our hope that this event opens a space for reworlding, to imagine and enact otherwise ways of being, knowing, and relating that exceed the constraints of coloniality and its afterlives. We invite you to engage generously with one another, Let this be a space not only for presenting research, but also for building connections and fostering collaborations that actively contribute to shaping Black futures. Thank you. I will now hand it over to Dr. Nalini Mohabir.
Thank you so much, Marliane. I really wanted to thank Simone de Beauvoir Institute for partnering with the Caribbean Studies Working Group to help us support and present this celebration of Dr. Merle Collins' work. And we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. And I also would like to thank PhD candidate Tesfa Peterson for conceiving of this event and planning all the activities that we'll be doing today. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Caribbean Studies Working Group because this is the first event that we're hosting as a working group, and really all our guests are here to help us launch Caribbean Studies at Concordia, and we think it is a long time coming. This working group has been spurred by graduate students like Michelle Fiedler, Tatiana Haustat, who advocate, if not demand, a space for Caribbean studies here at Concordia. And we really appreciate their interest and enthusiasm and support for recognizing the intellectual production that comes out of the region, the influence of ideas that seep into every discipline, from post-colonial studies to critical Anthropocene studies, and is deeply influential. It's also gathered here in the space together. I'm reminded that we also most of us embody Caribbean studies and recognize its long history in Montreal, dating back at least to the CLR James study groups in the 1960s. In Guyana, there's a saying, "Moon run till day catch 'em." We can do as much as we like, but not for long as we like. Therefore, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before, an ongoing theme in Professor Collins' work, as she explores memories of the past that reverberate sonorously into the present. Before her 26 years in the English department at the University of Maryland, Dr. Collins has lived a pan-Caribbean life. Born in Aruba in the Dutch Caribbean, raised in the Anglophone Caribbean setting of Grenada with a history of French Creole. And as Dr. Collins reminded us last night, she came of age in Jamaica at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus in the early 1970s, when the meaning of independence was being challenged by Black power and relationships to power in general reevaluated, including relationships to the university, its structures of knowledge, its relationship with the working class masses of the Caribbean. Her life and her life's work reminds us that histories in any one Caribbean nation are at once highly localized and as well as a shared struggle of a fight against unfreedoms that continue and are lasting across the region, also against broader world systems of racialized control that may or may not be immediately legible due to complex machinations. Dr. Collins saw this firsthand when she served as a researcher on Latin America for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during Grenada's People's Revolutionary Government. In addition to her scholarly writing, Dr. Collins is a poet. Her collections include Lady in a Boat and Because the Dawn Breaks, poems dedicated to the Grenadian people. I would also encourage you to take a look at the Grenadian exhibit that we have here in the space today, curated by Tesfa Peterson. Professor Collins is also a novelist, and her novels include The Color of Forgetting, Angel, Ocean Stirrings, which we're going to be focusing on today. Ocean Stirrings focuses on the women who came before Malcolm X, in particular his mother, Helen Louise Langdon Little, or Oceane in the novel. This novel, quote, a fictional story with factual scaffolding, as Dr. Collins describes it, was nominated for the Orwell Prize for Political Fiction in 2024. The chair of that prize describes it as, quote, capacious in scope, taking us from Grenada to Canada, and by Canada we mean specifically Montreal, to the USA, considering African inheritance and European power. Yet it's also a work of stillness and close attention, making space for the story of a girl in a Grenadian classroom reading Byron, unquote. Literary scholars such as Alison Donnell, Antonia MacDonald, and Shalini Puri, in their tribute to Professor Collins, calls this, in general, an ethical impulse in Dr. Collins' work, in which, quote, the authority of women's everyday experience, taken as significant when both remarkable and unremarkable, focus on bringing forward women's voices and their contributions to the struggle for self-determination. They ask, how might thinking with Merle's ideas and her works shift us from literary criticism to literary dialogue? And I hope very much that we will be in dialogue today, a grounding, if you will. We might also add that Dr. Collins' works help us to think about how to piece together the fragments of the archives across national boundaries to ensure the lives of Black Caribbean women are not erased, and to ensure the archive itself is not erased. It comes in many different forms, not just those of paper documents or a paper trail. It's also whispers, dreams, visions, shoo-shooing, as Tesfa has taught me. Her work helps us to rethink the possibilities of biography in Caribbean histories, its role as a genre, perhaps informed quite strongly by literary studies, and as one way to interpret the complex patterns of a life at certain historical junctures. To help us further our questioning and thinking with Dr. Collins' work, we're grateful to have two scholars of Caribbean literature here to join us. Professor Ronald Cummings from McMaster University and Dr. Laurie Lambert from Fordham University. Dr. Lambert is herself a Grenadian daughter who grew up between Toronto and Grenada and is now Associate Professor of African and African American Studies at Fordham in New York City. She's the author of Comrade Sister, Caribbean Feminist Visions of the Grenada Revolution, which examines the gendered implications of political trauma in literature on Grenada. She is also the director of Tambu, a short documentary on Jamaican folk culture. And I would like to make special mention of her chapter, Post-Colonial Stirrings, the Crisis of Nationalism, where she chooses to open this chapter with a letter from Rosie Douglas when he was a student here at Sir George Williams University, of course now Concordia. And he was writing to CLR James. And the letter notes, as she observes, quote, Montreal Congress of Black Writers, with its African diasporic focus, remains a critical example of how Caribbean intellectuals challenge the nationalist model. As Dr. Collins' work also reminds us of that, there's also a long history and legacy of that in Montreal. Professor Cummings is a professor of Caribbean literature and Black diaspora studies at McMaster University. He's a scholar as well as an editor. Most recently, he co-edited the Routledge Handbook of Caribbean Studies with Pat Noxolo and Kevin Riney. He currently co-edits Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies, and is a senior editor of the Journal of West Indian Literature. Also the editor of Make the World New, the poetry of Lillian Allen, as well as the volume Caribbean Literature and Transition, 1970 to 2020, with Alison Donnell. His scholarly work focuses on questions of decolonization, sexual citizenship, and Black freedom struggles, again, including that of our very own university, Sir George Williams student occupation that occurred here in 1969. All three of our guests today offer critical mappings of Caribbean and Black intimacies across boundaries. They trace ideological inheritances and help us recover the time-space of complex histories of Black resistance. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Merle Collins, who will be providing a keynote, and Dr. Lambert and Dr. Cummings will be responding. That will be followed by a poetic tribute to Dr. Collins, and then we'll break for lunch. After lunch, we will be Zooming with Grenada with Holy Innocent School, followed by a film screening of Sarika and Nation. And I do hope that you will stay and join us for the whole day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's great to see you all. So let me say that first of all. And Nalini just surprised me and put me off a little bit there because I didn't know there was going to be a poetic tribute. So, so good morning again. And I thank all of you. I thank the organizers here at Concordia, and in particular, Professor Nalini Mohabir and PhD student Tesfa Peterson for the tremendous amount of work they've been doing to make this possible, and I really appreciate the honor. And I'm pleased to be talking about all of this with Dr. Laurie Lambert and Dr. Ronald Cummings. And I'm pleased, of course, that you, the audience, will be part of this journey. And the title chosen by the organizers for today's presentation and discussion reflects the journey involved in the creation of ocean stirrings. So, living archives, moving tides, Black feminist Caribbean thought, and for me specifically today, creating ocean stirring. So what I'll do is talk about the process, how and why I created this work. And the presentation will essentially be in 3 parts. To some extent, because of how the novel itself is constructed. After each part, I will pause, have a discussion, or in fact, I think we've now decided that what I will do is not pause after each part, but simply speak through the 3 parts, and then we'll have a discussion. So I set the scene by talking a bit about what the work is about. Ocean Stirrings is a mixed mode work. Fiction, poetry, epistolary sections. That is, the letter writing sections. And it is very much, the book is very much informed by history, by archival detail. Sort of, what is the story that stirs the ocean? Because the title is deliberate. The main character is named Osea, or Ocean, if you're thinking more towards the English side of it, a Creole word for ocean. And I am suggesting, and I should say, by the way, last night I met someone who is actually named Osea. Good to see you. And I thought, oh my gosh, she had the name before I wrote the novel, but I didn't know about her at that time. So it was a great meeting. So now, what is the story that stirs the ocean? The main character is a Creole word for ocean. So there we have Océan, a Creole word for ocean. And I am suggesting that whatever is happening in this mixed mode work is a story created because of the stirrings of the ocean, because of a chaotic journey across the Atlantic Ocean, because of the recreation of existence for a variety of peoples on the other side of the ocean. It is a collective story of African and other peoples in the Americas. So let's think about what inspires me to that kind of research and storytelling. And it started with the life of the mother of Malcolm X, Louise Langdon Norton Little. In the autobiography of Malcolm X, I read, Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. Her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. And of course, this is Malcolm thinking, you know, from that period of the 1920s in Michigan, US. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad she had never seen him. So of course, reading that for me, there were some trigger words. Grenada, British West Indies, looked like a white woman, shame of a white father, and not just of a white father, but of a white father she had never seen. So all of that raised for me the specter of the plantation Caribbean and sexual violation of black women workers, the consequences for family structures, and then the eventual writing, because of course I didn't start writing immediately, you know, that stays there and I'm thinking about it, and the eventual writing happened after a research journey. And I don't start off thinking, okay, I'll write this. In fact, I first thought about images, how to do this, you know, how this would be presented. But eventually, after a research journey, it came out in fiction, poetry, letters, imaginative recreation generally. I give historical aspects of the life of the representative figure, because remember, this is a work of fiction. It's not a biography of Louise Little. So the representative figure is Oceane. She is the person who is stage center to represent the individual Louise Little, but also to represent her generation. So I write a story, I name the central character Oceane, and it is aimed at giving some details about the history and geography impacting the individual life, yes, but the lives of a number of people. In the work, I am inspired by the outlines of Louise Little's story, by the details that are out there in the public domain, the things that her son Malcolm X talked about too. And I thought a lot about how to use historical scaffolding for world making in this work of fiction and poetry. So to summarize the real life story that I found inspiring as I, researched it. Louise Langdon was born in Grenada in 1895. Researchers give various dates, but I have settled on 1895 based on the kind of research I've done. She had a colonial primary school education there. She traveled here, she traveled to Montreal in 1917, got married here in 1919, and left that same year for the United States of America, where she lived until her death in December 1989 at the age of 94. And as I say, from various researchers, you'll get, different dates, but these are the ones I settle on. To situate the story, I research and read the landscape. I go to her birth village, LaDigue, to see what it looks like now. I research what was happening in Grenada at the end of the 19th century. And where the landscape specifically is concerned, I research what rivers were overflowing, what floods, what hurricanes, what markets were being constructed. So where those things appear in the novel, those are true to history. I also researched what language predominated, what people might sound like on the streets, so that at the beginning of the novel, for example, I have people who are walking down the hillsides, talking to each other, and you get things like, Makume kumauye, how things, and what you know good, sauka dilla, Tiffy, you got a belly, girl, you looking nice, yes, and things like, and all of that, you know, the use of the language, 19th century Creole in Grenada, I had to, you know, go back and think about that and speak to various people. But the things that are happening in the grandmother's house, conversations in various spaces, that's my imagination based on details researched in various sources. It's fiction. And at the end, I have, you know, poetry again with a historical, geographical scaffolding. I use living archives, static archives, and interaction between the two. You know, the things that are there in the environment, but I'm also looking at libraries. In LaDigue, Grenada, I have discussions with community people to get a sense of what it is like now and what some might know about the past. I do oral history type interviews. So what other things set me off on a journey, and what was that journey? For Louise Langdon Norton Little, her stay in the US was particularly complex, and I wanted Ocean to absorb that and present that. Notice I'm speaking about Ocean as a kind of figure acting out Louise Little, because in the novel, this is essentially what is happening. She lived mainly in the American Midwest. She lived in Nebraska. She lived in Michigan. She had a total of 8 children. Her husband died in 1931, and remember that the two of them left here in 1919. Her husband died in 1931 when the 7 children were between 11 and 2. So think of this. She now is a widow raising these 7 children, and she had a rough time raising them. She had little moral support, well, moral or other kind of support from a local Michigan social services that had been suspicious of the family anyway, because they were known to be black activists. Louise Little and her husband didn't often follow the rules. He preached against the subjugation of black people. They both promoted Garvey's UNIA, and they lived in an area marked as one in which only Caucasians should live. Ocean, like Louise Langdon, had a rough few years following her husband's death. Difficulties, as I said, feeding the children. Malcolm X would say, for example, that there were times things were so bad that the children could eat the whole out of a donut. Their mother worked as a domestic at times for people who thought she was white. Remember, this is a woman who looks white, and who would fire her when the children went by to pick up something and they realized that in fact she was black. She was a woman, and social services were always watching her to see if she could manage the children, and also to see if she was falling into another relationship, because that would affect her pension, right? They wanted to see if she was feeding them, what she was doing with the things that would affect relationships, the things that would affect her access to her husband's pension. And about 7 years after her husband's death, Ocean, like Louise Little, had another relationship. She seemed hopeful that this man who looked like her tall, very dark husband, etc., she was hopeful that this man would be a good man and he would help with the children. She was feeling that in this kind of climate, you need a man around for people to respect you. She didn't know that this man that she hoped was good was in fact already married. She became pregnant. He deserted her. At the end of 1938, social services moved her son Malcolm from the home and they placed him with a family. They said he was difficult. They said his mother wasn't managing him. The new baby was a baby boy. She seemed to lose interest in her surroundings, became increasingly quiet and introspective. A psychiatrist said that she would just need some rest and she would be okay after a while. They seemed hopeful, the children seemed hopeful, but local social services personnel, political authorities weren't interested. They turned up one morning in 1939, took her out of the house, drove her to a mental institution where it seemed she progressively lost a sense of herself. So now we're talking about women and madness, right? Her children were young, between 3 months and 18 when they picked her up. They were unable to advocate for themselves, young, black, easily ignored in the American Midwest, particularly in the early years of the 20th century. Louise Little spent some 22 years in the psychiatric institution at Kalamazoo, and she was eventually taken out by her children just a couple years before Malcolm was assassinated. So it was a life traumatizing to her and to her children, a life that would have a shaping impact on the bitterness of her most famous son. So my interest in this story probably started with the autobiography of her son, Malcolm X. His description of her was a major inspiration for finding out not only the personal story, but the historical underpinnings, the kinds of things from the ocean that could have led her there. As people like Grenada's ex-ambassador Caldwell Taylor advised, I read an article by her oldest son, Wilfred Little, because when I spoke to Caldwell about it, he said, yeah, and there's a big story here in Montreal. You have to go to Montreal. So that, in fact, that started there with Caldwell's advice. And in that article by Wilfred Little, Wilfred was born in 1920, 5 years before Malcolm. He wrote about our family from the inside, and I quote him, Malcolm has attracted so much attention that people sometimes wonder, what is it that made him like he was? Where did he come from? How did he get to be like this? And in order to understand that, you need to know something about his roots and some of his experiences. That was Wilfred Little. So as I researched further, I found myself increasingly interested in the story of the woman who was largely silent to the public while her children talked. And of course, you know that that is the story of so many women. The children out there yapping, and the women are silent in the background, but they have influenced a lot of what is happening to the children. So I'm asking, who was she? What were the stories that went into creating other women like her? Who were these quiet, even silent women behind the more public performances of their children? Wilfred Little wrote that his father was from the US South and his mother from the West Indies, and that she had had more opportunity there in the West Indies for education. So of course I wondered about that. I started comparing stories about education in Grenada, education in Georgia, which is where her husband was from. In LaDigue, I moved from her home along Waterfall, because that's the area where they lived, you know, a house on the hillside above that road that is called Waterfall. And I walked along there to her school, the Holy Innocents School. I researched primary school education in Grenada. I used living archives. I went to the Holy Innocents Primary School, her old school, to see what it is like today. I spoke to Grenada relatives, including one relative, Terrence Wilson, within the family. He was a key person for early stories. In addition to that, I consulted the static archives, Grenada Legislative Council minutes. In the US, I went to Butler, Georgia. And these research projects always, you know, they sound so individual when we're talking about them, you know, like I went, I found, I this and that. But of course, it's always a collective, you know, and thinking about that too, because, for example, I knew nothing about Georgia or Butler, Georgia, but I had a student who was from Georgia. When I told her about the project, she said, come on, right? Come on down. So I went to Georgia, and Georgine Best, she drove me around to Butler, etc., because I wanted to see what was this space, where was this space her husband had come from. And this was part of the research. So in many ways, all of that for me was the beginning of a search for a story that sounded both individual and collective. Important not only to the shaping of the mother of Malcolm X, beginning in colonial plantation Grenada, but also to many people of her generation and later. For the novel, I also thought about the family of Louise Little in the American Midwest. I thought about how not only to situate Helen, Louise, and Oceane in the American Midwest, but how to trace the journey from the British West Indies to this space. Her son was also a very private figure, of course, so surviving family members I knew and realized later might well be irritated that so many people are openly researching his story. But Malcolm was also a very public figure who had a complex and positive impact on the thinking of the world. And in my case, I thought, you know, it's him, but his story has led me to what I consider an important story that is behind his becoming. And as I researched, I concluded that perhaps we haven't heard about the mother because the family was traumatized by key parts of her story. Malcolm, by his own account, didn't ever talk about his mother. And he said sometimes some poor fool might jump in, and he used those words, some poor fool might jump in and say something about his mother and really make him explode, so he just hoped nobody do it, right? Of course, this is when he was alive. And as I considered the American Midwest, when I saw her connecting with a few West Indians in her area in Michigan, I sought out Grenada again for an understanding of the individual in the diaspora. Some of the names she mentioned, Malcolm mentioned from the American Midwest, I contacted them, right? Knowing that, you know, that last name, okay, this person is from LaDigue. So I got in touch to find out if they had any, you know, association, etc. So to write both Michigan and LaDigue, I went to LaDigue. I spoke to people in Toronto. I spoke to people in the US. I also went to Michigan, went to one house where the family lived, the location. I went to the crematorium, the place where she was cremated. But again, it was always a back and forth because it was the US, it was Montreal, it was LaDigue. In LaDigue, I walked, I talked to people. I also did that in her husband's Butler, Georgia. I I came to believe that in the 1890s, the Langdon family was traumatized by the pregnancy of one of their young daughters, that in the family there were discussions about how to be as a young woman, why you should be careful with men, particularly with these white plantation boss type men, that when the young woman became pregnant with a child who was to be named Helen Louise, there may have been something of an effort to keep the mother out of the public eye. So all of this emphasized for me the collective story of history of plantation bosses. And I thought about the collective story of whiteness and trauma and complex stories of dissimulation sometimes for young black girls on the plantation, trying to make a living, trying to make a way in a world that is colored white. I considered the way that even at the time I was growing up in Grenada, I can't speak for now, but I imagine it's the same thing. One might hear stories, you know, a little, you said that Tesfa used the word shushu, a little shushuing about a young woman in a relationship with a white plantation type figure, and you hear people saying things like, is she going up for higher? Back on it. You know, so you can imagine those kinds of whispering, because white skin is always higher. You know, that, so I'm kind of thinking through all of these, the gossipy whispers, and also focusing on the choices for the young women who are trying to make it socially and otherwise in societies that are viciously class conscious, race conscious, you know, the colonial environment. And so I'm thinking a lot about the generation that was Helen Louise's. Also, Ocean's story is the story of the generation, not only of, well, it's Helen Louise, and that's my grandmother's generation. She was born in that same year. Perceptions of race and colorism passed on to other generations. And as I thought about race, colorism, characterization in the novel, I was thinking not only of Helen Louise, but of my light-skinned aunt, born in about 1918, and the way that within the family as a child, I'm told, she was more valued than my dark-skinned mother. So I'm thinking about all of these issues of race in colonial societies. I thought about Louise Little's grandmother, how early in the 20th century, she brought up a white-skinned child who came to value dark-skinned identities and to be part of black organizations. You know, she came to join the UNIA. So all of that story of race told me something too about the grandmother. And I remember reading a book by Jan Carew in which, you know, the daughter is mentioned and all of that. So all of that contributed to my perception of things. And also that, as you think about the novel, I can't say I know what happened in the grandmother Ma Miriam's house, but these thoughts contributed to characterization. And as I researched, I saw records of an Ella Langdon, who was the mother of Louise Langdon. And in the records that I saw, she was described as laborer, which immediately made me say, okay, so her mother was an estate worker. The term laborer is, you know, usually used to mean estate workers. And as I researched, looking at the living archives, I stood on the hillside near to the location of the Langdon home. I looked down at the sea. I looked across to the Atlantic Ocean. Ma Miriam in the novel stood in that same place where I stood to look across to the Atlantic. And LaDigue is close to Grenville. LaDigue is in the St. Andrews area, and that is the eastern coast of Grenada. And the east coast of Grenada faces the Atlantic. The west faces away, but the west faces the Caribbean Sea, but that east coast faces the Atlantic Ocean. So I thought of them standing on land, but looking at the turbulent Atlantic. And I thought, of course, also about Derek Walcott's The Sea is History. I thought about boats, research boats with Africans to be enslaved and liberated. So just looking at the sea helped contribute to this story of people in Grenada. I went to Richmond, also on that hillside above the sea, this place near Waterfall where Ella Langdon, Louise Little's mother, once lived. And just recently I was speaking to somebody who told me, oh yes, her mother and my father lived in the same area. So, I'm thinking that constantly you're finding out more as you interrogate the living archives. Thinking of Ocean's ancestry, I went to see where Langdon family members were buried. I visited the gravesites, and again, thanks to Terence Wilson for making that possible. Of course, I mentioned already that I went to Holy Innocents School, and thanks to Peter and the Institute for People's Enlightenment for making some of that possible. And in Ocean Stirrings, there's an omniscient voice making comments about the attitudes of the French and the British to that strip of land called Holy Innocents, where the school and the church are located. And when I went, somebody in the area actually asked me, you understand this place here? This Holy Innocents, this is a British spot, eh? So down there is LaDigue, but this is Holy Innocents because the British came and they didn't like the French, and they thought, these barbarous French people down there, we're going to have a strip of civilization. So in fact, this is somebody in the area telling me this is why we have this Holy Innocents here, the school and the church civilizing the new colonial British, because of course the French were there before. And all of that made me think of the Royal Readers, made me think of how Wilfred Little, Malcolm's older brother, he also said things like, my mother used to tell us to syllabize things, and she would take our homework and sit down with it and look at it. And the way that Wilfred Little used words in his article made me say, oh my gosh, she's going back to the colonial Royal Readers, which is why the Royal Readers quoted so much within the text. And then I actually traveled from Grenada to Montreal. When I say this, I could have come from Maryland, in the US to Montreal. But something in my head told me, okay, even if you can't take a boat in 1917 and go by sea, travel from Grenada to Montreal instead of from the US to Montreal, and so kind of internalize that. So I did that, trying, however minimally, to recreate the idea of the 1917 journey by Louise Langdon. And when I got here, I went to the Union United Church, which I'm told is the contemporary face. I'm told it's not existing anymore, but at the time, it's the contemporary face of the group of churches that includes the one in which Louise Norton was married to Early Little. And for some of that, an understanding of some of that, I again spoke to Caldwell. I'm told that parts of Montreal and United Union Church in the early part of the 20th century comprised a space welcoming to black activists, and that this was so during the 1917 to 1919 period that Louise Little was here. So that in fact, this was an important space for her. And I actually, as I say, I went to the church in 2017. I discussed Black Montreal in the early 20th century. I heard about it as a place very much in the making when she was here, the inference being that Montreal was just the place for her to be positively influenced at the time by the activism of black people. I heard of Edgerton Langdon eventually starting his own black organization here. I talked to people about the UNIA in Montreal, Diaspora, Caribbean Canadians Caldwell Taylor, Afua Cooper, Vivian Maguire, all of them were important in giving me something of the geography of Canada so that I would understand how Louise Little moved from the port of St. John eventually to Montreal. And I know Tia don't give me any kind of tests about that movement, right? I'm not telling you that I remember it all, but I remember these people being really important to my understanding of the geography. And here in Montreal also, I met with Professor Carrie Levitt. She was at McGill at the time, and I met with her, you know, talked to her a lot about I guess some of it was some of the Caribbean research that her father had done too. So that, all of that was important in giving me a perspective on things. And there too, I have to thank other people for telling me about her work at McGill. And then another thing was the importance of language issues to the construction of ocean stirring. So as I'm talking about spaces and places and, you know, LaDigue, Grenada, Montreal, I'm thinking of the colonial history of both spaces. Grenada had been colonized by the French from 1649 to 1763 for 114 years before the British took the island. So at the time that Louise Langdon was born in 1895, French and the French Creole, you know, those were very important linguistically. So I thought through all of that, and that led me to speaking to people from Dominica, St. Lucia. I actually took Creole classes because at the time that I was growing up, Creole was a secret language. My parents are speaking it, but they don't want to try to speak this language that won't help them in school. So now some of us are looking for the classes, right, to try to learn the Creole. And of course, there you have the contradiction, you know, different generations, and of course, different things are happening. I thought of the way that French, not only Creole, but also French was also spoken by some people in the late 19th century. So that when I see researchers talking about how Louise Langdon was a very educated woman, she spoke French, she spoke English, she spoke Creole, I have to go and do the research to find out if it is actually true. Well, I know she was very educated, but I think it was community education, you know, and the circumstances of her existence. Because this would be a time, for example, when the Our Father would still be said in French, you know, and you have people generally speaking French as well as Creole. So what is happening here then for me is it's a historical, cultural, linguistic journey. Sometimes as I wrote, I heard the voices of my mother's and my grandmother's friends walking alongside the hillsides of rural Grenada. You know, that little bit that I read for you at the beginning there too would be the kinds of things they would be shouting out to each other. And as I'm researching, realizing, hey, these are the kinds of things that Helen Louise's relatives are shouting to each other and friends are shouting to each other in Grenville. So, and as the story of ocean stirrings develops, and as Louise Langdon becomes Louise Norton and leaves Grenada, and perhaps we could talk about that more later on. Hey, why did she become Louise Norton? But with that, I focus on migration. How is migration, that individual migration, handled in the early 20th century? I research details about the ship, how she sees things on the journey because of her rural Grenada socialization, how she views the white officers on board, what she thinks when she's told, hey, you can go over to the white side because they're looking at her skin, and how she's thinking, I can't go over there. My grandmother, if my grandmother were alive, she wouldn't be able to come to see me over there, you know, and all of that. And I look at various imagined stops along the way. And when Ocean gets to the port of St. John, I return to narrative fiction, because for that trip across, I'm using the letters she's writing her dead grandmother. So that's the epistolary section. And then when she gets to the port of St. John, I use narrative fiction again. I looked at her arrival at the port of St. John. I thought of her working as a domestic and a seamstress here in Montreal later on to keep herself. I'm thinking, good for her. She arrives in June. Things wouldn't be so bad then with the weather, you know. I have her looking out of the window, etc. So just thinking about that, the physical, you know, and all of the things that she had to go through. So I think I will just say a few more words and then we can start talking, or you will say, my God, she's putting us to sleep before we could even have a discussion. So, all right. So she talks about, and then later on, she leaves in 1919. She marries Earl Little here in Montreal. She leaves in 1919. But of course, in the novel, she doesn't marry Earl Little. Ocean marries Baron, right, in the novel. They leave in 1919. They go first to Philadelphia, and then later on to the American Midwest as they're helping to spread Garvey's UNIA. And in Montreal, when Baron meets Ocean here in Montreal, he's very taken with this beauty. In the autobiography, Malcolm suggests that his father favored light-skinned people. And I consider that as I develop the character of the person called Baron in the novel. I consider what Malcolm said in the autobiography of Malcolm X. They get married, leave the US. So you can see I follow the outlines of Louise Little's story. And for the next 12 years, between 1919 and 1931, this diaspora Grenadian is trying to make her way in the United States. The section also shows how much Ocean has been influenced by her socialization and schooling in Grenada. And then when she is in the American Midwest, they have some run-ins with the Ku Klux Klan, the Black Legion, etc. And I researched the newspapers of the period, talking about Earl Little's death and struggles after the death. And then in the final section of the work, I turned to poetry to engage with what is essentially for her a fractured psyche. That's when they take her to Kalamazoo Psychiatric Hospital. So you can see the kind of journey I had with the novel and with decisions about, all right, is the section poetry, is the section letter writing, how might I best express it, etc. So thank you. I'll stop there and talk to Laurie and Ronald at this point. So thank you very much for listening to all of that.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to TESFA and Nalini and Caribbean Studies here at Concordia and the sponsors for today's event. Thank you, Merle, for a wonderful presentation, but also for your body of work, for your generosity as a scholar, as a writer. So we're talking today about centering Caribbean women's lives, their creativity and intellectual traditions. And for my response, there are 3 points that I'd like to focus on. The first is family as a living archive. The second is the remapping of space. And the third is this mixed modality work. So I'll begin with some reflections and then I'll end with some questions. So on family as living archive, we see in Ocean Stirrings Collins's turn to Louise Little's family, her children as an entry point to gleaning who she was as a woman, listening to the voices of her children like Wilfred Little, Yvonne Little Woodward, or even her family in LaDigue, reading the lines and between the lines of Malcolm X's autobiography. As with all of us, aspects of her identity were braided together. Her work as an intellectual, a writer, thinker, and organizer were woven together with her identities as wife, mother, granddaughter, and daughter. So the living archive in this instance is also a familial archive, emphasizing intimacy and community. And in Ocean Stirrings, in Collins's representation of Ocean, we see a proto-feminist character, right? We see Helen Louise as someone who was vocal in the home as mother and wife, who took the lead in educating her children, critiquing and redirecting the education they received in school. We see the language, and we hear the language, Creole and women's conversation, and the importance of Creole in the conversations that women have between themselves. So in Collins's hands, Helen Louise's generation is also one of the last generations to be fluent in Grenadian Creole. Throughout the novel, we see the importance of Creole in daily life, the way certain intimacies seem to be only expressible in Creole. And here I'm thinking of the many, again, conversations between women, between Ma and her children and grandchildren in the novel. Creole carries the history of plantation slavery and resistance to British colonizers. As a language, it is an archive of encounter and power struggles between European, African, and indigenous American populations. And here I'm thinking of the people who are indigenous to the Caribbean, to the archipelago. It is a language that needs to be embodied to really live, right? In the living archive, I also want to think about the royal readers. So the royal readers are a text, yes, that are ubiquitous throughout the British colonies, including in Canada. But in Ocean Stirrings, Collins shows us that the royal readers were more than textbooks or anthologies. I think about my own encounter with them, right? And we see that the royal readers is transformed. It's not just this static archive. So for me, I can remember these sort of red burgundy volumes that my father kept on the shelves of our home in East York and Toronto, volumes he would have had from his school days at Presentation Brothers College in Grenada, and the idea that it was important enough for him to move with those volumes, right? So in the being of Louise Little and countless other Caribbean folk, the royal reader was central to the iconography of a sound colonial education. I think in some ways the books were, like a fetish object almost, to keep them around, to be able to point to say, this is the education, that I had. The ability to read, analyze, memorize, and recite material from the royal reader was like a symbol of how far one had come and the potential of where one could go. So I would go so far as to say it marked a potential departure from the estate or plantation labor, a pathway to new horizons. And the mapping of that pathway is through the book as object, yes, but another part of that pathway is the body and one's ability to spontaneously reproduce and recite its text as a way of generating meaning and even identity. So in the hands and mouths of Caribbean readers, including Ocean, the royal reader becomes an oral text, one that is possible to pass down to her children because of how she incorporated it into her being. So what does it mean that she's able to share those poems and pieces with her children, that she carried them with her on this itinerary across the ocean? That potential, that legacy of the plantation is being left behind, that striving for better. And that's all part of what's being passed down. And it's part of what makes these scenes of education, I think, so important in this book. And And so, here I also just want to acknowledge the way that your work, Merle, has always engaged deeply with orality, your use of Creole, your inclusion of proverbs, the way you write dialogue, the way you capture rhythm, cadence, and particular vocabulary of Grenadian speech. And I think in this book, you also show us how even a written text like the Royal Reader enters into these conversations about orality because of the way that the book is part of these sort of transformative relationships. On remapping space, Ocean Stirrings traverses an itinerary that sees Oceane move from LaDigue to Montreal, eventually to Michigan. Her name itself, as you've pointed out, ties her to the ocean, a space that is both open and bounded, in many ways indeterminate. The Atlantic Ocean connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas, including the Caribbean, Canada, and the US. But another aspect of Ocean Stirrings that I want to attend to is how the book remaps gendered spaces, including the physical space of the classroom and conceptual spaces of the mind or intellectual life. So we have these figures of Sir, who is Oceane's teacher at Holy Innocents, and we also have T.A. Marichaux, who we know as a Grenadian politician, and they are familiar figures of Caribbean intellectualism, men of learning, right? So Sir is a teacher, he's a guide, he's a mentor, along with Uncle Iro, an important example of masculinity and leadership for Oceane. Through Sir and others, she learns then of T.A. Marichaux, this really important statesperson. Eventually, he's a young man when Oceane first mentions him in the book, a young journalist. And her mind is filled with ideas of his importance. Grenada's potential for social and political change in many ways is embodied by Marichaux in the way that he's evoked throughout the text. Through the classes that Oceane takes with Sir and her reflection on what happens in these classes, she learns, she really discovers herself as a thinking being. And initially, this is how we hear we hear Sir describe T.A. Marichaux as a thinking being, and Oceane really latches onto that, and we can sort of see the wheels turning. These men get to be thinking beings, and this is how we know to admire them and to look to them. But she is also becoming a thinking being. She's also working through this. The novel, this part of the novel really emphasizes the geography of education being mapped across public and private spaces for Oceane. We see Oceane as a young woman, bringing together the formal mode of the classroom and public discourse in newspapers such as the St. George's Chronicle and Gazette. And she's bringing that together with the informal education that she receives at home with Ma and in her village community. And so I think what's great in the novel is the way that Collins is able to highlight questions about how we conceive of education. While the British colonial government thought that reading, writing, and arithmetic would limit rural Grenadians to estate labor, and therefore providing colonial authorities with the workforce they needed to maintain commercial and exploitative interests, Collins shows us how Grenadians actually internalized this concept in a completely different manner. For them, being trained in reading, writing, and arithmetic was seen as serious business. An opportunity for book learning was an opportunity for advancement. So again, the meaning of certain kinds of education and where that education is supposed to get us is revised, it's remapped. And I think you really help us to see the brilliant way that Caribbean people all over kind of subvert the intended colonial project. So even if their lives did not give the appearance of immediately being transformed by that education in terms of class mobility, there's a preparation that's happening. And we see through Ocean the very fact that possessing certain kinds of knowledge was already shifting the tides for her, right? Learning from formal and informal spaces could be stored up. It could be reflected upon until it was needed at a later date, until that opportunity came up where you could begin to actualize it. And for her, that opportunity is migration, right? The literal moving tide. In the novel, when there's talk of introducing scholarships that will eventually go to poor children, affording them the opportunity to go to high school, Collins illustrates women talking about how, well, these scholarships will likely go to boys first and then eventually to girls. So this question of gender and opportunity arises again. We see throughout, however, that young women like Ocean were not waiting. You know, her grandmother who's raising her, Ma, understands the conditions of the time and place, and she saw to it that Ocean received as much formal and informal education as she could, and prepared her to take advantage of the opportunity to travel. So she knows that she could not afford to wait on opportunities provided by the colonial authorities, and also that they had to make their own opportunities, right, in spite of what the colonial authorities intended for them. And I really appreciate this loving representation of Ma as an example of a woman who makes a way for her children and grandchildren. As I was rereading it, I thought about Paula Marshall's Triangular Road, where she talks about her grandmother, who also, you know, had this land in Barbados, and every time one of the children had to go away, okay, she's gonna sell this piece, and that's gonna send this one to New York, then she's gonna sell that piece, and, you know, that's gonna create this other opportunity. So we have, in Caribbean women's literature, these representations of these women who make a way from very humble beginnings, from very modest resources. And then the mixed modality of the work. So here I want to ask you a question that centers really your creative process. Ocean Stirrings is a mixed modality work, blending fiction, poetry, and the epistolary modes. You've also written a scholarly article for Caribbean Quarterly entitled Louise Langdon Norton Little, Mother of Malcolm X. And you're at work on another iteration of her story in a digital format. And this reflects something that I see overall in your body of work. It follows a pattern. And I've written about some of this, your multiple engagements with the Grenada Revolution across genres, essay, poetry, fiction. And I was thinking even about your work on Big Drum and Saraka, which includes a documentary and an essay. So what do you learn as an artist when you delve into a topic across multiple genres? And what do you hope your audience will take away from these engagements? Then you've written about seeking inspiration in different ideas of space, and even traveling to the Faroe Islands because you heard your grandmother talking about them. I was Googling Faroe Islands, okay, Denmark, Copenhagen, and I'm imagining you going there and thinking, okay, you know, your grandmother, I think you said, had learned about it from the royal readers and is reciting this, so then there you are, you know, going out there to see. What's important to you to understand about space when you write, and in particularly in the writing of this book? What were the sorts of spatial questions you needed to answer to understand Louise Langdon, the historical figure, and Ocean, the fictional character? And then finally, how has your relationship to orality changed in your work across the years? There are little things that I noticed that I think I've mentioned to you before. The orthography in the Creole is different in Angel than it is here, and I guess reflecting some of your study of Creole more closely. But what was it like when you first started writing to make your own way into this voice so closely attuned to Grenadian sounds and cadence? And I can't tell you how important that is to students in the classroom. Anytime I have a Grenadian student, you know, when they come in my class, okay, we're reading Caribbean literature, and so, you know, we might read some Jamaican writers, some Bajan writers, and so on. When somebody from Grenada gets to read a Grenadian text in the classroom, it is so special to them to see in your work and to hear in your work the sounds and cadence of home. And so I just wanted to know, how do you negotiate orality in your work today? Thank you.
Okay, maybe there's a pattern of thinking in threes, because I've also oriented my thinking around 3 points that I want to come back to. And just to say thank you, Merle, so much for this book. It's so expansive and offers so many ways in. Some of my questions also relate to some of the things that Laurie has raised, but also I hope to add some other questions to the discussion. So as I said, I've divided this into 3 parts, and I've titled this How to Stir an Ocean. The first part is titled The Town That Is Theirs, and I take fragments from some of the sentences in Merle's book. The town that is theirs. To light on LaDigue, you have to see the sea. Not the actual place, but its horizontal promise as it comes into view in Merle Collins' book, Ocean Stirrings. In the opening sentence, we're told, from the hills of LaDigue, they look down at the ocean, talking secrets to the sand, shoo-shooing, playful, intimate, running up and easing back, down there, near La Bay, the town that is theirs. Collins' opening sentence gives us more than setting. It ushers us into a relational view of place and the histories of its people. The sentence and those which follow trace the poetics of Caribbean memory and historical geography with a knowing certainty and with language tuned to the contours of place. And so maybe, in tune with Laurie, I want to continue to think about this question of place. As we enter the space of the story, a reader might contemplate what secrets do these sands hold, what ocean journeys do they remember, what arrivals and departures have they witnessed, and the successive ebb and flows of the tides, or what Collins evocatively calls that running up and easing back of the shoreline. And what does it mean to claim a town, a place, land as theirs, particularly a place that looks out to the sea, a place washed by history? The time is 1895 when the novel begins, and these are the generational folks that Erna Brodber would call the second generation of free men. And I want to think about this idea of claiming a town that is theirs in the context of these colonial geographies. These are the inheritors of the promise of emancipation of 1838. And I hear this being both interrogated and affirmed in that sentence, the town that is theirs. So in entering this narrative, I might say that I also recognize this place, not because I have been there, but because I too grew up in a place where one can look down at the ocean, its vast tides and returns. It's the place that the Jamaican poet Edward Baugh called A Rain-Washed Town by the Sea, which is inspired, and his work has one of my favorite poetic lines that I constantly go back to, which is this image of the ocean. So his poem, The Warner Woman, begins with the line, "The morning shimmers in its bowl of blue crystal." This wonderfully surreal image that is evoking the Caribbean Ocean. So in reading Baugh's poetry, I want to say, much like Collins's work, it captures the sense and sensory saturation of place and asks us to think about what it means to live in a place where on any given day, at any given time of the day, one might glance at the soft, constant shoo-shooing of the ocean tides, its glamour, its ordinariness, its lushness. So there's recognition in this. The shoreline at the water's edge looking down at the ocean is where many of us meet. I've argued elsewhere and still maintain this, that Edward Baugh, who grew up in Port Antonio, where I'm from, became one of the leading scholars of Derek Walcott's poetry because they both grew up inhabiting coastal geographies that oriented them as writers and scholars and oriented them to each other and to the world. So for Walcott, that shoreline was Castries. For Baugh, it was Port Antonio. So I enter Collins's text as a reader from a shoreline, watching a writer trace with such care and intention the vast and knowing expanse of another Caribbean shoreline, and mapping this as a space from which we might orient a view to, from, and of the whole world. So we watch with ease the way she does this in the sort of meditations on and the varied meanings in which that people attach to the notion of town, the way they map this, in their conversations. The folk are the best cartographers of the world, Collins seems to remind us. They attend to the vast and verdant expanse of land, the meetings of ocean shores, and the turns and tides of trade and of market. So I want us to consider carefully how she maps La Bay and by extension LaDigue for us. And I love that these spaces are relationally mapped, in the text. So here's a sentence from the opening page. Sometimes town people act as if town, which is what they call St. George's, the capital, is the center. But to people around La Bay, their town is really the main place for everything. For good kingfish from the sea, for crayfish from the river mouth. And again, the meeting of these waters is interesting for me. For a nice new market these days, for cocoa now that cocoa is in swing, for nutmeg, for everything. It is where they meet and greet each other. So there's a lesson here about how Caribbean people map themselves in modernity and how modernity is reinscribed from those centers that might seem as colonial margins. And I love the ways in which cocoa emerges here as this sort of almost a kind of new luxury thing that allows us to think about, these rescripting of centers and margin. Like, in what ways and on what terms do particular sites become important at particular historical moments? So what does it mean that these everyday things that are part of people's lives become inscribed to Europeans as luxury? There is a whole thing about, now about how white people have discovered goat and oxtail, and I think this is part of that, ongoing conversation that I see in this book that, is continuing in spaces of social media. But what I really want to say is that the Caribbean port town through which goods might pass has always been an orienting space for new cartographies of the world. And this book reminds us of that. And it's a book about Louise Langdon Norton Little, but it's also about the place where she's from. And in our conversation, I want to foreground that question of geography, or perhaps the geographies of the text, and to think about the complexities of mapping them. And I think to add to Laurie's questions around geography is how can we think about Grenada, not just in the late 19th century, but in the 20th century, and the ways it becomes important to particular mapping of global geopolitics. How might we also bring that into this conversation in thinking about Grenada and modernity? So part 2 I've called shoe-showing, playful, intimate, running up and easing back, the force and beauty of Merle Collins' linguistic style, or hush now, keep so much noise in the white people shop. I have a video that I'm just going to play a brief clip from, and it's of Merle reading a poem by Kamal Brathwaite. Okay, maybe we can come back to it at the... Okay, maybe we can come back to it at the end of the session, the section.
Every night before gets into bed.
So I've long known about Merle Collins.
I ain't no pearly man. Anyway, the
It's
body
going?
and dead. No man, you even looking more hearty already. Then all I can say, and I say it again, we got to thank God for small mercies. Amen, Evie child, and again I say is amen. Miss Evie? White people shop, but you take it. Every night before gets into bed. I bet you're feeling less poorly already. I ain't no pearly man, anyway the body ain't dead. No man, you're even looking more hearty already. Then all I can say, and I say it again, we got to thank God for small mercies. Amen, Evie child, and again I say is amen. Miss Evie, I want you to trust me, half pound of flour and 2 cake of soap till Monday come with the will of the Lord. Write 2 cake of soap and half pound of flour in Olive Black Balance book for me, Maisie Mohabir. And Olive, don't forget about the biscuit and saltfish your daughter Marilyn come here and say that you wish to take out last month. Monday, Davy, I settling every brass bill and penny that owe in this shop, Miss Olive Mohabir.
Okay, we can
Hey,
stop.
Mary, you there?
Okay, thank you. So I've long known about Merle Collins, and like Laurie, I've studied the fictions of the Grenada Revolution and their surfacing of hope and possibility. And there, it was where I first met Merle Collins reading Angel. But my first sort of like real contact with her was when Nalini, Kai Callow, and myself worked on this project called 40 Nights of the Voice. And we reached out to her to read one of Kamau Brathwaite's poems. And the poem that she chose to read was this poem, The Dust. And it's an interesting poem because it lingers in the space of the shop as the women talk about life. And Kamau, attuned to nation language, captures the everyday poeticism of Caribbean speech here, as language itself runs up and down the shop. Ocean Stirrings, I think, offers an expansion of this kind of poetics, and I do want us to come back to talk about the language here. So in this book, the shop, the commercial street, is one location where we met here and see and feel the pulse of life. It's where people meet and greet. And I'm interested here in a kind of choral poetics that we see in that first part of the book. And it was lovely to hear you read, like these phrases from that opening section of the book in your presentation. And I'm really interested in the ways in which people use language, but the ways in which they are aware of language, and as the way in which we as readers become aware of language. On the second page, you write, sometimes they have to help up 2 languages to tell the story going on around them. Sometimes one is enough, and always they laugh out loud, sounding gleeful as if they have secured the secret for survival. So I'm interested in this sort of like sense of the richness of language and its possibilities for telling. And I think the force of this opening sentence of this book is not just about orienting space, but also orienting us linguistically into a culture of storytelling. And one might make connections with this to the famous opening sentence of Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, with its seemingly direct sentence, quiet as it's kept, there were no marigolds in the fall of 1941. So here, the African-American vernacular phrase, quiet as it's kept, used for sharing gossip and exposing hidden society issues, becomes our introduction to the story and our introduction to a particular narrative voice. And I think that Merle signifying the ocean, talking secrets to the sand, shoo-shooing, playful, intimate, running up and easing back, orients us to the deep narrative histories of this text, but also in this is an introduction to a narrative voice full of dexterity and dimension. And I do want us to talk about, the linguistic choices, but also the registering of Creole in this text, which, like Laurie, I find really fascinating. So the third thing and the third part is I've titled Talking Secrets to the Sand, and Ocean Writes Back. And I want to talk a little bit about the letters because I found these really interesting, both formally but also what they're able to do in terms of narrative. So one of the most impactful sections of this book for me is part 2, Letters to Ma, 1917 to 1919, where letters structured the narrative. And this is kind of the first major shift in the form of the book, in this multimodal text, as you describe it. And it's not coincidental that this shift follows Ocean's departure, which ends the first part of the book. And I think there's a way in which, for those of us who have read Caribbean literature, we're used to this as the sort of ending of the story. But I love that it's a shift into another space of narrative, but also another form of narrative. And I love that there is this, so the ways in which the expansive flow of this text is able to contain this journey, even though we get it, fragments of it through letters. So here we encounter letters as part of an ongoing rescripting of modernity itself, and we can think about the letter as a kind of transnational genre, but also as a kind of diasporic technology. But the Dear Mar letter is a staple narrative genre of Caribbean life, not just Caribbean literature, but Caribbean life. We all write back to our mothers. And we get an instantiation of this in literature, for example, in Dion Brand's At the Full and Change of the Moon, in Linton Kwesi Johnson's poem, Sonny's Letter, but also in Alexis Pauline Gumbs's essay on daughterhood and diaspora, which itself is a sort of writing back to Dion Brand's At the Full and Change of the Moon. And I want to linger with a question that Alexis Pauline Gumbs poses and meditates on in that essay on daughterhood and diaspora, because part of what she asks us is how might we read the letter, the Dear Ma letter, as a script of daughterhood. And I think in sort of our conversations about Black feminist praxis, I'm interested in the ways in which daughterhood is being written in these letters. And it becomes a kind of particular subjectivity from which to narrate the question of diaspora and mobility. And I'd love for us to talk about that some more. So a kind of conclusion, and I come back to the phrase, they can look down at the ocean, as a way of thinking about the significance of this book for me. Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic was published in 1993 and radically shifted how we think about Black studies. His formulation of The Black Atlantic offered another register for thinking about the vastness of Black diasporic worlds. Yet folks have, lots of contentions with Gilroy's work. But I'm also reminded that Carol Boyce Davies published Black Women Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subject in 1994, the year following Gilroy. And I think there's something about her formulation, Migrations of the Subject, that is useful for me as a way of reading this. And I read this both in terms of thinking about Ocean herself, Ocean's mobility, but a kind of migration of the subject. How is she differently situated in each space? And of course, by the end of the book, we come to the space of the hospital. So how might we think about these different forms of migration that the book attempts to chart, and also the shifting forms of the book themselves? So for me, reading this is like, oh, this is a book that we might think about through returning to Carol Boyce Davies' book in 1994. And to do this offers us a fundamentally different map for thinking about Black diasporic mobility. And I also want to think with Alexis Pauline Gumbs' work in an essay that she published in 2011, titled Dion Brand, A Poetics of Diasporic Domestic Radicalism, where she asks us to think about the tensions between mobility and domesticity in thinking about the formations of the Black Atlantic. And she does this in a number of ways, where she's thinking about, the ways in which women's production, women's economies becomes located in relation to the domestic. But also part of that is thinking about the histories of the domestic labor scheme, particularly here in Canada. And the women from Grenada, I'm thinking about figures like Jean Augustine, who came as part of that history of the Black domestic worker scheme here in Canada. So I'm interested in the ways in which thinking about domesticity and thinking about gendered migration asks us to ask a different set of questions about the Black Atlantic. And then I'm also interested, like Laurie, in how we might bring this work into conversation with Polly Marshall's work. And here I'm thinking about Praise Song for the Widow. And then I also want to ask about, Canada and doing that work in terms of mapping Canada and Montreal, because that for me also seems to be part of this ongoing discussion and dialogue with Gilroy's formulation of the Black Atlantic, where many folks argued that Canada was kind of left out. And I'm thinking about, the kinds of work that this book is doing in filling in those gaps. But I'm also interested in, and you were showing the slides that she moved from, she arrived in St. John's in New Brunswick, right, which is another port of entry for thinking about these movements and formations. So maybe I want to close by returning to the beginning and thinking about that rich opening sentence, that rich opening phrase, from the hills of LaDigue, they can look down at the ocean. And I want to raise the question of what it means to look down at the ocean, and what does this mean for thinking about Black Atlantic formulations. And perhaps to say that for me, this text offers a kind of way of, a form of stirring in how we think about the Black Atlantic. And for me, we might think about LaDigue as a sort of central space of the Black Atlantic, because it's where we can look down on the ocean. And perhaps part of this is this charting of, this plotting of different details in the lines of the Black Atlantic, where anywhere we can look down on the ocean becomes a site that is worth attention in our mappings of the Black Atlantic. So thanks for this, and I really want us to come back to these questions around geography, language, form, and gender as part, as part of these discussions.
Thank you both for those responses, those questions, etc. And Nalini, I'm going to be looking to you to guide us through this, because you know how much time we have and etc. Right? So, but you raised so many interesting things here, both of you, and I wanted first of all to say something about Laurie's comment on sort of the unfolding meaning and unfolding engagement with the royal readers, so that you read it, or they would have read it at first, and their response then might be very different from their responses later, etc. And that made me think about Wilfred Little saying something about Malcolm, because their mother used the royal readers with them a lot, from what he says. And Wilfred Little talking about going to the prison when Malcolm was in jail and telling Malcolm, don't you do the time, don't let the time do you. And pick up the dictionary, study things. And the important thing for me there was, remember what Ma would do. And to me that was so key, because this is about Ma using her education with them. And we might say a little education, that she had from primary school in Grenada, but this is what he told him, remember what Ma would do. Pick up the dictionary, study the books, study the dictionary cover to cover if you have to, so that you get a sense of expressing yourself. And go back to the mother there. So that made me think about the unfolding engagement with the royal reader, because whether or not they knew it then, that is about an engagement with her early education, which was all royal reader, So that was one thing. So when you talked about that unfolding, that's the moment I went back to. And talking generally, because you had similar questions, and if you find I'm not responding to your questions specifically, tell me, right? But I'm thinking also about the idea of the ocean and the engagement with the ocean, because they are there, sometimes looking in a similar sort of way, looking at the sea and not necessarily thinking about journeys across the Atlantic, you know, not necessarily going back to think about enslavement and in their particular case, for example, in this story, the Grenada family tells me that they were this group called Liberated Africans, their ancestors. But I'm saying, you know, even then, whether or not one or two of them may have been from this group called Liberated Africans, it's still engagement with the ocean. Because what these liberated Africans were people whom the British, in the period after, what was the year, 1807, when the British decided, hey, the slave trade, not slavery, is at an end now, and the British were no longer going to the coast of Africa, then other European countries defied this British dominance of the ocean, and they say, we're going anywhere, we're going to get the Africans to be slaves. And the British would then stop these ships from the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish, stop them on the high seas and take away the Africans, you know? And say they're liberating them, but what they're really doing is putting these Africans to work in their countries, yeah? So that, for example, there's a ship that's going to Brazil, a Portuguese ship on its way to Brazil. The British stop it on the seas in the 1830s, and another one later on in the way down, right, in the 1860s. They stop these ships on the sea, and they take the Africans to Grenada or to Trinidad or to some other place. So, you know, thinking about that, this engagement with this sea is constantly there, whether people are speaking specifically about something or not. You know, so that when Terence in Grenada, or when anybody I interview in Grenada, you know, tells me, all right, these were liberated Africans, it doesn't suggest that they were not part of this whole transport of Africans across the Atlantic, but you think about how individuals engage with that idea. So there's always an engagement with the sea, whether it's happening directly or not. So that in a sense, it's similar to how when people are standing looking at, for example, in the Saraka, and people are looking at the ring out front as if there are people there, and there might be no one dancing, but it's as if they are looking at the spirits. And I think of a similar thing where looking at the sea is concerned. People are standing on the hillsides, and I'm not talking about the tourist sea now, but standing on the hillsides, looking at the sea, really looking at an entire history. And that's one of the things I want to convey or try to convey in the work, that is an engagement in itself with history, just watching the sea and not knowing details, but knowing in a sense that there's something there to engage with. And then the issue of language, and I'm just jumping about here and you'll focus me when you want to say, okay, but you didn't answer that. But where language is concerned, I am always fascinated with our languages throughout the region, throughout the Caribbean, because you think of the ways that parents, and very often the mothers are the women are the ones who engage directly critiquing children or not, you know? And I'm thinking of the way, for example, that in my imagination, Ocean's grandmother, who takes that role, but also my mother, you know, would say, and listen to the language in which she would say it, Merle, is you out there talking? What kind of language you talking there? I'm sending you to school every day and so you're talking? So you're getting the Creole in her response. But effectively what she's telling you is, don't speak this language, you know, because in order to advance in this world, you have to use another language. So please use that language. But even as she's critiquing you, it is in that language. And I feel that there's so much wisdom that is passed on to children in the Creole that I want to, my sense is elevating the Creole. Because the Creole in our societies continues to do a tremendous amount of work. You know, it's a tremendous amount of heavy lifting by individuals, but also by the language itself. And when you think of the amount of wisdom that's passed on in both what some call the French Creole, the St. Lucians, my St. Lucian friends tell me, don't call it the French Creole, don't give the French all that thing, just call it Creole, it's Creole. And I say, well, you know, in Grenada, we were really focusing on two kinds of Creole. We had to know which one we're talking about. And then they're telling me, don't say patois, because patois means, you know. So each country has a particular way of sort of dealing with the language, the complexity of the colonial inheritance, in a sense, and that fascinates me. I think language itself has so much to tell us about our becoming, our constant becoming. And the interesting thing for me is that I love the Creoles, you know, so I'm constantly engaging with them to find out, to see, you know, what we can get from there, or what has been passed on, even if it has not been considered important. And that's, to me, that's the contradiction. You know, it has not been considered important, but it has been so important that, and a lot of people who hear me talk about these issues often would hear me mention my mother, who was a center of so much. But also there's a question, I think one of the things you mentioned, Laurie, as you were talking, was about education and the way they're perceiving it, the way children, the way the older people present education and the way education is perceived by the children. And I'm always conscious about, again, the silent women behind these stories of education, because and there is a work of activism, you know, that is being constantly done, I think, by individual women during my generation, yes, but in different ways now too. Like, I remember thinking of my mother and my father. My father would simply say, you know, well, you know, we had too much money, so if we have to focus on education, it's going to be the boys, eh? And afterwards, if it have anything after that, you know, then, you know, yes, I'm not against sending her to high school, you know, but let's focus on the boys. And then my mother would say nothing. She would just listen to that. And then the space of the kitchen, she would come with me afterwards. You hear what your father say? So you better study your head, all right? Because if I had to go on and scrub floor to make sure you get the high school education, you're going to get it. But you're here. You know what I mean? So all of that is to kind of push you, and it's a quiet kind of activism. And I'm mentioning my mother only because that's, as I'm investigating other people's personal experiences, my personal experiences help to explain, you know, help to get me into that space to understand their becoming. So that even being able to write a character that is Ma Miriam in the novel, you know, I am thinking of my great-grandmother. I'm told that my great-grandmother spoke no English at all. Her languages at that time were French and the Creole, yes? So then I say, okay, I could think about who this character is, you know. And so all of these ideas, so I'll pause there and let you focus me, or let another question come. Mm-hmm.
While we're waiting for a question, I wanted to come back to Laurie's question about orthography.
Oh.
And sort of like some of the selections you made about how you represented the Creole in the text.
Yes, the orthography changes constantly as I do research. Because, for example, trying to decide how to write the 19th century Creole, I spoke a lot to Morgan Dalfinis, who is a researcher from St. Lucia. And Morgan researches Caribbean and African languages. He's written a book, in fact, called, titled Caribbean and African Languages. So I spoke to Morgan about Grenada's 19th century Creole. I spoke to him about the things my relatives would say. I would say words to him and he would say, but I'm not sure that is how you should write it because this word is, you know, a particular kind of word. We use it in St. Lucia too, and it's, when I did the research, this is what it is. And I said, well, perhaps things change over the years because Grenadians pronounce it. And so we would sit and have a long conversation about how Grenadians pronounce it today. Did that, what I sense is a B? Could it have been a P in the past? And Morgan, with his understanding, his own individual research on Grenadian, on Caribbean and Caribbean Creoles and African languages would tell me, all right, this is the origin of that word, and it encounters French here. So it becomes that. So we had all of those kinds of intense discussions. So when you see changing orthography between Angel and other books, it's also because of that, as I discuss it more fully with researchers and hear their interpretations, you know, from what they know, the language researchers. That's why you see a bit of a shift at times. But when I'm reading it, I hear the same sounds, so that, of course, I use the language as I hear it, as I remember hearing it on the streets as I grew up as well. Okay, does that answer that question? Yeah.
Thank you so much for those generous responses. We really do want to have a dialogue as well with people who are here in person and also over Zoom. So I think we'll turn to questions from the audience.
Yes, anyone joining us on Zoom, if you have a question, you can put it into the chat. Our team will read it out. And here in the space, because I know there's a lot of people online and shared community, we are going to bring our camera to sort of see who's asking the questions. If you don't want that, just put your hand up, wave your hand at us, and we will not do that. So anyone here in the space, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring this microphone.
I think there's a great deal said about language. And I suppose this might be from a sociological perspective, I don't know. But when I think of language in the Caribbean, I'm thinking perhaps of the war in Jamaica, for example, between the use of patois and standard English. I'm also thinking about how the trauma of colonialism is actually played out in language across the Caribbean. So I just, in as much as, you know, there's so much being said about language, and rightly so, I just wondered whether you might want to address that issue. In fact, your example of the mother speaking in the local language, in nation language, urging the child to speak standard English, contains that huge contradiction, again, about class and upward mobility, and perhaps even a hint of trauma from the point of view of an inferiority complex, if you understand what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that question. I'll suppose I'll just give you a little bit of my perspective on it and we'll see how that is. Because I agree with you that there's a lot of trauma where language is concerned. And I was interested in that too, and found myself researching what the Legislative Council was saying about things like language, you know, during that period. And interestingly for me, soon after the novel was published, there was another work published by Merle Hodge in Trinidad, and Merle too had obviously been doing research on the Legislative Council and language. So language is certainly something that is, you know, constantly there for us as writers. And I'm remembering something that the Legislative Council, that I saw from the Legislative Council minutes of 1910, I think it was, in which they were saying that the working people speak a Creole, which is similar to the Creole that is spoken in Louisiana. And the Legislative Council minutes say it is absolutely forbidden in the schools. And that's a quotation, right? So I thought this is why parents have that attitude too, yeah? Because of course it's about upward mobility and what the colonial government considers appropriate, etc. So yes, these languages were not allowed in schools. Not only that they were looked down on, but they were, as the thing says, absolutely forbidden in the schools. So children, and of course I engaged with that too in Ocean Stirring. So children here were, of course, not allowed to speak it in the classroom. We see Sir in Ocean Stirrings asking a child, you know, what is that? You know, what are you saying? So it is trauma where the colonial experience and language is concerned, but also the colonial experience and culture generally. Recently, I saw something circulating on media, a boat with dead people drifting up onto one of the shores in Grenada, it was, and people are looking at the boat and saying, whoa, look at them African. The idea being, you know, that these people looking so debased and whatever, you know, it's there in the tone, in the tonality of everything. So that them African doesn't refer to us at all. You understand what I'm saying? So I think that the colonial trauma goes beyond the actual use of the language to a response to race and culture and everything. So all I can say is the trauma is there. I understand why parents and other people would have been encouraging children not to use this language, but I am at a space now where I'm saying it is important to use and understand the emergence of these languages, and in fact, important to use both, because I am not saying, hey, don't use the English language, or don't use the French, or whatever the other language is, the other colonial languages, because yes, you need it. But don't have the condescending attitude towards the Creole.
What I would say is that by our using it, what I'm saying is by our using it, and I myself do, you know, I could say that honestly I was flogged in school for actually writing an essay in the local language. But that's aside, I think we as writers do have indeed to use the language, reify them, and so on, because without literature, languages die. Yeah. And yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that.
There's a question here.
Thank you all Thank you, guys. Mine is more less a reflection and less a question and more a reflection on what you guys were talking about the Caribbean, not the Caribbean, sorry, the ocean as a space endowed with so many meanings for the Caribbean. And it made me think of something that I heard all my life. My mother said that she's worked so hard for me not to do what she had to do, which is work 30 years in this town in my country, in Guadeloupe. And she said that people there were rude from morning to night, right? And they just woke up rude and just frustrated. And so she would not want me to do the same thing. And then she would say, it's as if they forgot how we ought to be with one another, with each other. And then right after, she would say, that's because this is the only place, only space, only town in the whole island where there's no access to the ocean. And at first, I always thought, okay, maybe they're rude or they're frustrated because they don't have access to the beauty of the ocean. But even our conversation and then my own reflection made me realize that it's because, if they forgot how we ought to be with one another, it's not the touristic beach, right? It's the relationality of Caribbean life. And so, because Ronald, you were talking about that space and how it meant so much for you when you read it at the beginning of the novel. The ability of seeing the ocean, of looking up and seeing the ocean, not just as a space of beauty, but to remember where we come from, who we are, our histories, as Merle said, right? So I wanted to share that, and maybe if other people have like similar stories of meanings of the ocean for Caribbean life.
I would just add to that, Ronald, I think it's really interesting that you brought Port Antonio in conversation with LaDigue, because that, as a Grenadian going to Jamaica, that has actually been my feeling going to Port Antonio, that it reminds me of Grenville, what is being referred to as LaDigue in Ocean Stirrings, that it really, there is something that both of those spaces evoke that's very similar.
Are there any questions on Zoom?
I'm not seeing any questions on Zoom, but if you do have one, you could raise your virtual hand and you could turn on your microphone and camera that way, or you could type it into the chat and we could read it out. We do have a question over here.
Okay, maybe we could take a few questions.
Sure. I know we're getting close to lunchtime, and there's too many questions. It's great. Okay.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon. So, first of all, thank you for this beautiful panel. I think when I first heard you were working on this book, I read your article about Louise Langdon, or Louise Norton before. It was going to be a work of nonfiction, and you made the decision to make it a creative work of fiction. So could you say a bit about the importance of art, literature, and poetry in terms of the, I don't know, historical and political imagination? Thanks.
Were there any other questions? Maybe we can take a few at the same time.
Yeah, see, 1 second.
Thank you to the panelists, Dr. Collins and Tesfa and everyone for organizing this. I'm Grenadian, I'm from the South, fortunately. I wanted to delve in a little into the characters in your novel. And you speak a lot of the grandmother. It seems as though this is where it all started. And the whole class structure and mobility. And for a lot of us in the diaspora, well, for me in particular, it started there for me with my grandmother wanting a better life for me, migrating, coming to study, you know? And I just, with Louise's story, you highlight the tension of being able to pass for white, but she chose not to. how did you approach the portrayal of internalized colorism as a mechanism of class in your novel?
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for everything that you've shared this morning. My question is particularly on the maternal, and through this conversation and through the book, like I'm having this sense of the maternal knowledge being simultaneously hidden and also very much reproductive in a literal sense. So I'm curious, I would like to hear more about this. I'd like to hear you all talk about this a little bit more. Growing up in Jamaica, like I feel very much, my grandmother used to sit me down and read the Bible with me every Sunday, and even though I'm not a Christian anymore, I found that that was really instructive teaching for me in terms of how I move through the world. So just like to hear more about that.
Thank you. Let me comment then. We have a few questions here, so let me begin with one thing that I didn't answer before, the idea of the mother-daughter relationship, the script of daughterhood, and the letters, being written. And I think, yeah, I like that. I like your term for it, the kind of script of daughterhood thing. Because, yes, when she's writing, when she's traveling to Montreal and she's writing to her mother, to her dead grandmother, yeah, that is a kind of exchange, because she's remembering all of the things she has been taught in her life. And yes, later on, yes, it is that kind of script. And then later on, when she has a sense that, she's kind of losing control, and her younger daughter is saying to her, Mommy, you're talking to yourself. Mommy, so there's that kind of thing. And she is saying, when the daughter leaves, she's talking to her mother. She's talking to her grandmother. She's saying, Ma, she's talking to her dead grandmother. She's saying, Ma, they can't see you, so they're thinking I'm talking to myself. So again, there you have, she's going back in her own imagination to the things that have shaped her. So that script of daughterhood, in my estimation, it doesn't start there, but it continues there with the letter writing, and it's in other places in the novel, especially when she loses, later on when she goes into the mental institution again, and she's losing, a sense of herself. Her grandmother remains, in her head, and she's constantly going back to her. So yeah, the importance of these shaping women figures, mother figures in her life, I certainly think that's there. Then the other questions that were just asked about the imagination, poetry in terms of the historical and political imagination. Saying, yeah, it's to me, the creative process, it's writing a novel, writing these letters, writing the poetry. I think all of that, for me, it's always kind of infused with that historical imagination. Those ideas are always there. And as someone was mentioning Brathwaite earlier on, for example, I think of the way that, yes, it's creativity, but it's also the history in there. When I first went to do my undergraduate work at Mona, I was telling someone last night that when I first went to Mona, my education had been completely the colonial texts. And I went to Mona saying, hey, my favorite poem is Hardy's The Darkling Thrush. I leant upon a coppice gate when frost was spectre gray, even though at that point I had no idea what frost was. That what Hardy was talking about, right? But that was my colonial education. And then at Mona, I heard Brathwaite reading his poetry. Yes, I'm doing all kinds of other things because I went to Mona to study the Victorians and the Romantics. And that's where I discovered Caribbean literature, and Mona was just starting an African literature focus. So that's where I discovered both and decided, hey, you know, I am going that way. But I heard Brathwaite read, so we're talking literature, yeah? But we're also talking history. I heard Brathwaite read the poem that you were introducing people to there. I heard Brathwaite read a poem that goes, "Evening, Miss Evie, Miss Maisie, Miss Maud, Olive, how you? How you, Evie, child? You take that miraculous bush for the trouble you tell me about, child, every night before I gets into bed." And I'm thinking, hold on. Right? This is different from Hardy, and it's different from, you know, Wordsworth and a lot of the other things that were my world before this. But it is a voice I know. Can you do that in poetry? So, you know, those kinds of questions. And of course, Eddie Ball was also at Mona at the time, and hearing what these people were doing with the literature. And Ball was teaching me, by the way, he was teaching me the Victorians, but he was also writing his own Caribbean voice poetry. And that had a tremendous impact on my imagination, teaching me not only about literature, but also about history. So that question that you asked about literature and history, it always seemed to me that I can use literature when I'm investigating the historical imagination, whether it's fiction or poetry or whatever else. And you know, I say a lot of thanks to Mona for that, for the kind of shaping that was both, you know, using my colonial education, but also not completely dissing the colonial education, you know, and understanding the kind of interaction of history. I remember, for example, on one night when I went to hear the drumming of the mystic revelations of Rastafari on campus, and I had an essay to write for a Victorian class, Eddie Ball's class the next day. I had an essay to write about the Victorians, and the mystic revelations just drifted into that essay, you know? So I'm writing all about the Victorians, but I'm also writing about my enthusiasm for the mystic revelations, and I thought Eddie Ball would wipe the floor with this essay, but he talked to me in such a way about it being good to see that my enthusiasm for the local also, you know, that I could talk about the enthusiasm for the Victorians in terms of that. So I thought then of literature and history, what these writers at Mona were teaching me about that interaction, you know, how to kind of respond to the colonial in particular ways. You know, we can decide how we're going with it, whether it's, you know, all rejection, or whether we can see ways to do that kind of interweaving. So this is why I'm always definitely in favor of the Caribbean voice, but also conscious of interacting with, opposing, engaging with, you know, depending on what I think it demands, the colonial voice. And yes, the trauma of the colonial imagination, because it always, and something I wrote recently, you know, I said, for example, one person said to me, what is on with Malcolm and this X? He give up his good name and he saying X. And I remember my response being this good name that all of us have, you know, the names like the Collins and the Buckmeyers and the whatever else that we have, these good names that we all have, we can decide, we have decided to engage with the trauma because the trauma is there in the name. The story of the historical trauma is there in the name. And he decided to just exit out. You know, it's a question of choice. So just thinking of all of those things. I think perhaps I never write literature without also thinking about history. It's always there for me. I'm not saying that's how it has to be, but it's always there for me, perhaps because of my own experiences. What was the, okay, that was the poetry in terms of the historical and colorism as a mechanism of class. Yes, that too I engage with, and it's there in the novel. I remember, for example, Malcolm talking about his, the fact that he was the lightest skin of his parents' children. And in a strange way, he thought that his father liked him best because of that. And he thought that his mother was always giving him a rough time precisely because of that. So that his mother would say to him things like, don't think because you're a little light-skinned, you're more important than other people. So he's remembering his mother's training. And I was fascinated by this because, of course, she was the lighter-skinned one, you know? So just thinking of all of those things too, it was clear to me that colorism is something that she consciously engaged with and consciously taught her children about. So it's there. And, you know, there's also the fact that she is a very light-skinned woman, as Malcolm says, you know, could pass for white, from LaDigue, and she chose not to. But then I'm also thinking of her last name, Norton. So that, you know, so there are these contradictions. So that one member of the family, I remember telling me that he didn't understand why, when she became Norton, meaning that he knew about the Langdon last name in Grenada. But she becomes Norton when she leaves Grenada. And another member of the family saying, well, that probably means that this whole rape story, although it is in the autobiography, is not quite true. I remember another family member saying that. And as I thought about it, I said, you know, people can be leaving the country. And some of you might have examples of, you know, that happening in your own lives or in the lives of friends, that the person you knew as Jean Urias yesterday is leaving the country, and she picks up her birth paper, as we say, and discovers that, you know, in fact, she's Jean Johnson. Right? So suddenly she might decide to use her middle name, right? So you look at the person you knew through school as Jean Urias is suddenly Janice Johnson. And you say, but who is this? You know, and this is precisely because of what she discovered when she went to pick up her birth certificate. Somebody had registered her perhaps with her father's name. And it said, this is family, this is run. So in my estimation, all of that is part of the trauma, you know, of these colonial relationships. And in her case, I am suspecting, I don't have the evidence, by the way, and that was one of the things that made me decide, you know, as I started off with thinking of a kind of biographical work. Excuse me. And I had my own questions. I decided, you know, I can't put this out there as a biography because even the family members I've spoken to have different interpretations about the pregnancy, about who is actually the mother, about whether there was some kind of cover-up. I'm not going to put this out there as a biography. The things that I have been able to prove so far that I know are still coming out as a work of nonfiction, and also in the form that I had first intended to do everything. But that explains some of my, as I did the research, that explains some of my decision, hey, you know what, this is going to be a work of fiction. Have I answered all the questions you asked? What was the last one? Did I answer all of them? Yeah? Okay.
Dr. Collins, Dr. Cummings, Dr. Lambert, I wanted to thank you all so very much for this rich conversation. I think we've enjoyed it thoroughly. And just very quickly to say that you've given us so much to think about in terms of the implications of these histories as history, but also in the present, particularly in these times that we see in the US, where Black studies, critical race studies, and undying white supremacy seems to be persistent, and in this province as well, with the tensions between the Anglophone and Francophone communities. So much more that I hope we can discuss over lunch. So again, we're so grateful for this conversation, which is only the beginning of our day. We're gonna take a break. There is lunch, I think, at the back of the room. So please do, on the side. Please do help yourself, and we're going to reconvene at 2 p.m. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Nalini. Also, thank you to everyone joining us here at ForSpace and joining us online. We're going to close up the live stream to YouTube right now, but those of you joining us on Zoom, we'll leave our Zoom open, and you should stick around, have a lunch, and we'll see you at 2 p.m. Those of you here in the space, lunch is on the other side, and that's great. Thank you.